The square at Harrow's Crossing was not a large place. It was perhaps 60 feet across, packed dirt, gone pale from frost, bordered on one side by the general store and on the other by the feed barn, whose doors had warped so badly that winter that they no longer shut all the way. A flag hung from a post near the courthouse steps, stiff with cold, barely moving in the thin morning air. By 10 o'clock, most of the town had gathered. Not because they were summoned, though they were. They came because there was little else to do in late October, when the fields had already been put to sleep, and the first hard freeze was still a week or two away, sitting somewhere out beyond the mountains, like a thing that had not yet made up its mind. Ingrid Voss stood on the wooden platform that Harlow Priest's men had built 3 days prior from good pine boards, and she kept her eyes fixed on the roofline of the building across the square. It was a habit she had developed long ago in her father's house, when it was better not to look directly at the thing that was happening to you. The roofline was plain and uninteresting. That was precisely why she had chosen it. She was 27 years old. She wore a blue dress that had been washed so many times the color had gone soft, like sky seen through river water. Her hair, the pale gold of winter wheat, was pinned at the back of her neck. She was fuller figured than the women who stood watching from the boardwalk, broader through the shoulder. Solid in the way of a woman who had spent her life doing work that needed doing. Her hands were folded in front of her. Anyone watching closely would have seen that her fingers were not relaxed. They were pressed together knuckle against knuckle, the way a person presses a wound. Harlow Priest stood to the right of the platform, in his good coat, the one he wore to church, and to the bank, and to occasions such as this one, which he had described in the notice posted to the church door, as a Christian matrimonial arrangement for the benefit of unattached women of the community. He was a tall man, narrow-faced, with the kind of patience that came not from good nature, but from certainty. He had been certain of things his entire life. He was certain now. The man acting as auctioneer, a red-faced fellow named Simmons, who usually handled livestock sales over in Billings, raised his gavel and called out again over the crowd, $22. Do I hear 25? The fifth man in line, Frank Dunmore, stepped forward. He was perhaps 40, heavy-set, with a sheepskin coat and the particular expression of a man who found himself amusing. "I'll take her for the winter," he said loud enough that the people on the far side of the square could hear him plainly. "Same as renting a mule." The laughter came quickly, the way laughter does when a crowd has been standing in the cold for a while and is glad of any relief. It moved through the gathering like a wave, and died out, and in the silence after it, Ingrid did not move. She did not look at Dunmore. She did not look at the crowd. She kept her eyes on that roofline, and she breathed in and out, slow and even, the way she had learned to breathe when she was small and her father's voice was rising in the next room. But her feet shifted. It was a small movement, almost nothing. Her left foot moved forward half an inch on the pine boards, and then stopped, as if she had meant to step somewhere and then remembered she had no place to step to. As if the body had tried on its own to leave, and the rest of her had known there was nowhere to go. One man standing at the back of the crowd saw it. He was not part of the gathering in any meaningful sense. He had arrived in town that morning from the mountains with 4 bundles of pelts tied across the back of his horse, meaning to sell them to Alderman's trading post and buy 30 pounds of salt, 2 spools of good wire, and a length of rope. He had gotten the rope. He was holding it now, coiled over his left shoulder. Standing near the edge of the square, where the crowd thinned out, watching the proceedings, with the expression of a man who has not yet decided whether to stay or go. His name was Reuben Mare. He was 36 years old, and had lived alone on a mountainside for the better part of 5 years, which had made him quieter than he used to be and more attentive to small things. The way a branch moved, the way a horse held its ears, the way a woman's foot shifted on a wooden platform, in a moment when she had been publicly reduced to a joke and had nowhere to put that fact except inside herself. He watched her foot stop moving. He watched her fingers press together harder. And then Frank Dunmore stepped back, satisfied with himself, and Simmons raised his gavel again, and Harlow Priest smoothed the front of his good coat with one hand, and Reuben Maury thought about Celeste, who had stood very still in just that way in the last year of her life, when she had stopped expecting things to get better and was only waiting to see what would happen next. He did not think about it long. $50, he said. His voice was not loud. But the square was quiet enough that it carried, and the crowd turned, and Harlow Priest looked up from his coat, and Ingrid Voss, for the first time in 40 minutes, looked away from the roofline. She looked at him. He was looking at her, not at the crowd, not at Priest, at her directly, the way a person looks at someone they are making a decision about, clearly and without performance. Priest's eyes had gone narrow. "Mare," he said, "haven't seen you since spring." Reuben Mare did not look at Priest. $50, he said again, cash. To understand how Ingrid Voss came to be standing on that platform, in the pale October light, her fingers pressed white against each other, and her eyes fixed finally on the face of a man she had never seen before. We have to go back to a morning 7 months earlier, to a kitchen that smelled of pine smoke and wet wool, to the last winter that Lars Voss ever lived through, and to the silence that followed him out of the world like a shadow. Part 1. Lars Voss had been a quiet man in life, and he was a quiet absence in death. He did not leave behind a great deal of noise or disorder. He left behind 40 acres of rocky Montana land, a house that needed the south wall replastered, a mule named August who was developing a bad habit, with his back left hoof a Bible, with the family names written inside the front cover, in ink gone brown with age, and a debt to Harlow Priest of $170 accumulated over 3 bad winters, when the crops had not come in the way they were supposed to, and the price of grain had not cooperated with the needs of the man trying to sell it. He also left behind 2 children. Eric, 34, who had taken over the eastern parcel 3 years before, and had his own house and his own debts and his own way of looking at things, which was generally straight ahead at the middle distance, in the direction of whatever he had already decided. And Ingrid, 27, who had stayed in the family house because someone had to, because their mother had been gone since Ingrid was 11, and their father had grown worse at managing things each year, not from badness of character, but from the particular tiredness that accumulates in a man who has worked very hard for a very long time and received very little in return. Ingrid had managed the house and the kitchen garden and the 3 remaining hens, and the medical needs of the surrounding families who could not always get to the doctor in Harrow's Crossing, who was not always sober in any case. She had learned what she knew about medicine and plants from her mother Astrid, who had brought a single book with her from Norway, handwritten in her own mother's hand, full of drawings of plants and their uses and notes about preparation and dosage, and the particular ailments of women that the male doctors of the time did not consider worthy of serious study. Ingrid had read that book until she knew it the way she knew the layout of the kitchen floor in the dark. She had added her own notes in the margins in pencil. She had learned things from the women she helped that were not in the book, and she had written those down too. The town knew she was useful. The town was not particularly grateful. That was not unusual. Useful women in small frontier towns were often treated like good wells, expected to be there when needed, and not thought about the rest of the time. Lars Voss died in February in his own bed with the sound of wind off the Beartooth Mountains coming through the gap in the south wall that Ingrid had plugged with old cloth and would have repaired with plaster if she had been able to afford plaster. He died in his sleep, which was a mercy, and Ingrid sat with him until morning, and then went out and told August the mule, who was the only one who needed immediate informing, and then walked across the frozen field to tell Eric. Eric had said the things a person says in that situation. He had put his hand briefly on her shoulder. He had looked at the floor. Then he had asked about the debt to priest, and Ingrid had told him what she knew, which was that it existed and was substantial. And Eric had nodded slowly in the way of a man who has received information that confirms something he had already suspected and was still not glad to have confirmed. The months between February and October were not eventful months, at least not in ways that would be apparent to an outside observer. Ingrid planted the kitchen garden. She harvested what came up. She put up the tomatoes and the beans and the dried herbs and the preserved fruit in the way her mother had taught her. In the cellar, below the kitchen floor, where the temperature stayed cool enough that things kept through the winter. She called on neighbors when they sent for her. She read her mother's book in the evenings by the lamp. She was by most measures doing fine. She was not by any honest measure doing fine. She was holding the shape of fine very carefully, the way you hold water in cupped hands, knowing that the moment you lose attention, it will be gone. The house was lonely in a way that a person can get accustomed to and still feel every single day. The evenings were the worst of it, not because evenings were bad in themselves, because they were not. There was something to be said for a quiet house and a good lamp and a book. But there is a difference between chosen quiet and assigned quiet, and Ingrid had not chosen hers. She had simply run out of other options one by one over the years until the quiet was what was left. She was 27. The women she had grown up beside were mostly married. Some of them had 2 and 3 children. They were not unkind to her exactly. But there was a certain way that married women in small towns looked at unmarried women of a certain age, a particular brand of pity that dressed itself up as concern and occasionally as gentle advice about making more of an effort. Ingrid had received this look often enough that she could see it coming from a considerable distance. She was bigger than most of the women in town. Her mother had been the same way, broad-shouldered and full-figured and entirely untroubled by it, a woman who took up her share of space and was unapologetic about the fact. Ingrid had not inherited the unapologetic part. She had inherited the shape, but not the comfort with it. And the years of sideways glances and overheard comments had done their slow, unremarkable work on her. She did not think of herself as ugly. She had looked at her own face long enough to know it was a reasonable face with good cheekbones and eyes, the particular gray-blue of a Montana sky before rain, and the birthmark below her left ear that she had always been self-conscious of. A small curve of darker skin shaped something like a crescent moon, which her mother had called a mark of the moon, and her father had simply never mentioned at all. She covered it with her hands sometimes without thinking. It was not a deliberate gesture. It was just a thing her hand did the way hands develop habits of their own over many years. 3 weeks before the auction, the Gould family sent for her. It was 2 a.m, which is the hour when babies in Ingrid's experience most often decided to arrive, and the knock at the door was Charles Gould, red-faced from running a quarter-mile in the cold, his hat in his hands, saying that Martha's time had come, and the doctor was not answering his door. Ingrid had her coat on before he finished the sentence. Martha Gould was 31 years old, and this was her 3rd child, which under normal circumstances would have meant a faster labor, but nothing that night was behaving according to normal circumstances. The baby was large. Martha was tired in the particular way of a woman who has not slept well in 3 months, and has been working her own household through the final stretch of a pregnancy, because there was no one else to do it. The contractions were hard, and the progress was slow, and by 4 in the morning there was a quality to Martha's breathing that Ingrid recognized from her mother's book and from the one labor she had attended where things had gone seriously wrong. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands steady. She had brought her bag, the worn leather bag that had been her mother's, with the dried raspberry leaf, and the ginger root, and the small bottle of lavender oil, and the clean cloths she kept rolled and ready. She made a tea from the raspberry leaf and coaxed Martha to drink it slowly. She warmed cloths in the basin of water Charles kept bringing her from the stove, and pressed them where they would help. She talked to Martha in a low, continuous voice about nothing in particular about the garden, about the sound the creek made in spring, about the way the light came through the kitchen window in the mornings, because sometimes a voice is more useful than medicine. At 6 in the morning, as the first gray light was beginning to show around the edges of the curtains, the baby came. He was 9 pounds and had the round, indignant face of a person who had objected to the entire process and was not yet ready to forgive anyone for it. He cried with considerable force. Martha, who had been gray with exhaustion 20 minutes earlier, opened her eyes and looked at him with the expression Ingrid had seen on the faces of mothers before. That particular expression that has no name and needs none. "God sent you to us, child," Martha said, and reached for Ingrid's hand. Ingrid held her hand for a moment. She was genuinely glad. The gladness was real, not performed. She felt it, the way she always felt it in these moments, clean and uncomplicated, the satisfaction of having done a thing that mattered. Then Charles walked her to the door, thanked her twice, and then a third time pressed $2 into her hand that she tried to give back, and he would not take, and she walked home alone in the early morning, her breath making small clouds in the cold air across the field that was white with frost, to a house where no one was waiting, and no lamp had been left burning. She stood in the kitchen in her coat for a little while before she took it off. She put the kettle on. She sat at the table. She was very tired. She did not let herself think about what she was tired of, specifically, because that particular thought was one of the ones she kept penned up on the other side of a door in her mind, because if she opened the door, it would not come through quietly. She drank her tea. Outside August, the mule made a sound in his pen, a low, discontented rumble, and she thought that she should check on his hoof in the morning. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. A week before the auction, she went to Priest's general store to buy salt. She needed salt for the preserving she was still finishing up, and Priest's store was the only place in Harrow's Crossing that reliably had the kind she wanted. She did not enjoy going there. Harlow Priest himself was rarely at the counter that time of morning, and his clerk, a young man named Aldous, who was not unkind, usually managed the transactions without incident. That morning, 3 women were already in the store when she arrived. Mrs. Crowley, who lived 2 streets over and was married to the man who ran the freight office, and 2 women whose names Ingrid knew but had no occasion to use very often. They were standing near the bolts of fabric at the back, and they were talking, in the particular way, of women who have found a subject that is sustaining them. Ingrid took the salt from the shelf herself, brought it to the counter, and waited for Aldous to come from the back. She could hear the women clearly. They were not lowering their voices. "I heard he's calling it a matrimonial arrangement," Mrs. Crowley said, "to make it sound respectable." "It's an auction," one of the others said. "It is," Mrs. Crowley agreed, "and I wonder who he'll put in it. There's the Jensen girl, but her cousin's been asking after her, and they say the widow Marsh is considering." A pause, the quality of which Ingrid recognized. "I wonder if he'll put Ingrid Voss in it. Lord knows no man's looked at her twice." The laughter was quiet, conversational, the kind of laughter that is not meant to be cruel and is cruel anyway, because cruelty does not require intent, only indifference. Ingrid placed her coins on the counter. She picked up the salt. She walked to the door. She stopped at the threshold, her left foot forward, just for a half a second, a pause so brief that anyone watching might not have noticed it at all. Then she stepped through and into the street and pulled the door shut behind her. She walked home. She did not cry because she had learned long ago that crying in response to that particular kind of remark only confirmed something that she was unwilling to confirm. She walked home, and she put the salt away, and she went back to work, because there was always work, and work was reliable in a way that other things were not. That evening after supper, she sat by the window and watched the Beartooth Mountains go dark against the sky. The mountains were one of the things she genuinely loved about Montana, a fact that had surprised her when she was a girl, because she had grown up with them and familiarity usually dulls appreciation. But she had never been able to look at the Beartooth Range without feeling something settle in her chest. They were ancient and large and completely indifferent to the small troubles of the people living at their feet, which she found perversely comforting. She took her mother's book from the shelf. She turned to the page. Her mother had written, in the last year of her life in handwriting, slightly less steady than the rest, the letters still careful, but formed more slowly. Every plant has its place, even the ones that grow on stone. Her mother had written it as a note about a particular type of lichen she had found growing on the rock face behind the house and what it could be used for and how to prepare it. But she had underlined the first two sentences in a way that suggested she was thinking of more than lichens. Ingrid closed the book. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. She did not sleep well. In the morning, Eric came. He knocked at 7 o'clock, which was unusual. He knocked again before she had finished dressing, which told her something about the state of his mind. She opened the door, and he came in without being asked, took off his hat, and stood in her kitchen, looking at the floor with his shoulders, carrying the particular posture of a man who has made a decision he knows is wrong and has made it anyway. He put the paper on the table. It was a single sheet folded once. She could see Priest's name on it, and numbers, and her own name written in a hand she did not recognize, which meant Priest had written it himself and not had Aldous do it, which meant it was official in a way Priest wanted her to understand. Priest wants his money by sundown, Eric said. He did not look at her. This is the only way. She looked at the paper. Her name was there. Just her name in ink. No explanation required. The explanation was already done. She had known in some part of herself, she had kept very quiet, that this was possible. She had known it the way you know a storm is coming, when the light changes in a particular way, 2 days before, when there is not yet a cloud in the sky, but something in the air has shifted. She had known it, and she had not known what to do with the knowing. So she had put it on the other side of that door in her mind and gone on with her days. "Did you at least argue for me, Eric?" she said. He looked at the window. The frost on the glass, the gray sky beyond it. He did not answer. She stood there for a moment, looking at his profile, at the line of his jaw, that was so like their father's jaw, at the set of his shoulders, that had always been slightly too heavy, as if he were carrying something that had been placed there without his permission, and that he resented, but did not know how to put down. She did not say anything else. She went to the bedroom and took the blue dress from the nail on the wall. It was the best dress she had. The color had gone soft from washing, but the fabric was still good, and the seams held. She had let it out twice through the bodice, and the alterations were neat, because she was a careful seamstress. But they showed if you looked. She put it on. She stood before the small mirror hung above the washstand and pinned her hair back. In the mirror she could see the birthmark below her left ear, the small dark crescent that had been there since she was born. She raised her hand and covered it the way she always did, the way her hand had learned to do without being asked. Then she stopped. She looked at her own face in the mirror for a long moment. She lowered her hand. "This is my mother's face," she said quietly, to the woman looking back at her. She said it the way you say something you are practicing believing. She said it, and she tried to mean it, and she did not entirely succeed. But she said it, and that was something. She went out to meet her brother. She did not look at the paper on the table as she passed it. She did not pick it up. She walked out the door and stopped for half a second at the threshold, left foot first the way she always did, and then she kept walking and the door swung shut behind her in the October wind. The square at Harrow's Crossing held its cold, the way stone holds cold deep and patient, so that even when the sun came fully up, it did not warm the ground so much as it made the frost visible each crystal, catching the light and throwing it back in small, sharp pieces. By the time Ingrid stepped up onto the platform, the gathered crowd had been standing long enough that they had shifted from curiosity to something more settled and less charitable. Waiting made people restless. Restless people were not kind audiences. Simmons, the auctioneer, priest had brought in from Billings, had the practiced ease of a man who had spent his working life assigning values to things. He did not look at Ingrid as a person. He looked at her the way he had learned to look at everything on a platform as a problem of presentation, a matter of getting the numbers moving in the right direction. He straightened his lapels. He cleared his throat. He began. The first man was Otto Greer. Greer was 61 years old and farmed a quarter section 5 miles west of town. He had buried his wife 4 years prior and had not, in the opinion of the town, adequately recovered from the inconvenience. He came forward when Simmons called for opening bids, looked Ingrid over from his position below the platform with the slow, assessing expression he used when buying livestock at the Billings Fair, and said, $8. $8. Ingrid kept her eyes on the roofline. The second man was Ned Culver, whose father owned the saloon and who was 23 years old, and found most things in life amusing. He bid $12 and accompanied it with a low whistle that got a few laughs from his friends at the back. The third man was A.J. Hooper, who farmed the land adjacent to what had been the Voss parcel, and who had made no secret over the years of his view that women were most useful when they were working. He said $15 and added, in a tone of practical clarification, that he needed a farmhand and not a wife, which distinction he seemed to feel was an honest one, and which produced laughter of a different quality than Ned Culver's whistle, broader and more comfortable, the laughter of people who found directness refreshing. Ingrid's fingers pressed together. The fourth man was Pete Sallow, who she knew by sight but not well, a thick-shouldered man in his 40s, who had come to Montana from somewhere in the South and never talked about it. He said $18 and looked at her with no expression at all, which was in its own way worse than the others. The fifth man was Frank Dunmore. Dunmore was the sort of man who had learned early that people would laugh at almost anything if it was delivered with enough confidence, and who had built a considerable portion of his social standing on this discovery. He stepped forward with the ease of a man approaching a stage he had been standing on his whole life. He looked up at Ingrid. He let the moment sit. "I'll take her for the winter," he said. "Same as renting a mule, a chimney." The laughter was the biggest of the morning. It rolled through the crowd and broke against the buildings on either side of the square and came back again, and Ingrid stood in the middle of it and looked at the roof line and breathed. In and out, slow, even. Her left foot moved, forward half an inch on the pine boards, and stopped. It was nothing. It was barely a movement at all, but it was the movement of a body, trying to leave a situation that the rest of the person knew could not be left. And it was one of the saddest things looked at, honestly, that the square had seen that morning, though no one in the crowd was looking at it honestly, because that would have required stopping laughing first. One person was not laughing. He was standing at the edge of the square, where the crowd became sparse near the mouth of the alley beside the feed barn. He had a coil of rope over his left shoulder, and he was watching the platform with the particular attentiveness of a man who has learned to observe things carefully, because his life has occasionally depended on it. He had arrived in Harrow's Crossing that morning before 7, tied his horse at Alderman's post, sold his pelts for less than they were worth, because Alderman was Alderman, and it was late in the season, and there was no point arguing, and had been making his way through his list of errands. He had gotten the rope. He had been heading for the salt when the noise from the square had made him stop and look. He had told himself he was only looking. That had been 20 minutes ago, and he was still looking. And Dunmore's joke was still hanging in the air. And the woman on the platform had not cried, had not flinched, had not looked away from whatever point on that roofline she had chosen to focus on. And her foot had moved and stopped, moved and stopped. And Reuben Mare knew that movement the way he knew the sound of ice shifting on a frozen river, which was to say he knew it in a part of himself that was below thought and older than words. Celeste had stood that way, not on a platform, not in public, in their kitchen in the last year. When she had stopped telling him how she felt because she had told him, and it had not changed anything. Not because he had not listened, but because there was nothing to be done about what she felt, which was that she was tired and frightened, and the mountains were very far from the life she had imagined. And the loneliness of that particular fact was not a thing that could be fixed by any action either of them was capable of. She had stood in the kitchen and held herself very still, and he had stood across from her not knowing what to do, which was the worst thing about it, not that he had done something wrong, but that he had simply not known. He was not thinking about Celeste now, or he was thinking about her in the way you think about something that is part of how you see not a thought so much as a lens. What he was seeing was a woman who had been taught over a long time by many different people and situations that she was not allowed to simply stand in a place without having earned that right. He could see it in the way she held herself. He could see it in that foot that kept starting forward and stopping. He could see it in the way she had covered the birthmark below her left ear with her hand earlier before she climbed up to the platform, a gesture so brief and unconscious that he doubted she knew she had done it. Harlow Priest had made his own bid. $30. He had put it out there with the smoothness of a man who had scripted the entire morning and was now arriving at the conclusion he had always intended. Simmons raised his gavel. $30. Do I hear more? Going once. Reuben looked at the woman on the platform. She was looking at the roofline. Her fingers were pressed white. $50, he said. He said it at a normal volume, the way he said most things, which was not loudly, because he lived alone and had no reason to develop the habit of projection. But the square had gone quiet enough in the moment before Simmons brought down the gavel, the way squares do when everyone is waiting for something to be finished, and his voice carried. The crowd turned. He walked forward, not quickly, not slowly. The rope was still over his shoulder. His hat was a wide-brimmed felt hat, dark brown, the brim soft from years of use. His coat was the coat of a man who spent serious time in serious weather, heavy oiled canvas over what appeared to be a layer of wool with a collar he could pull up against the wind. He was large, not in a way that announced itself, but in a way that became apparent as he walked through the crowd, and the crowd made room without being asked. His hands were at his sides, the left one empty, the right one carrying the faint ghost of a scar across the inside of the wrist. Priest's eyes went narrow. "Mar," he said, "haven't seen you since spring." Reuben did not look at Priest. He looked at Ingrid. She had looked away from the roofline. She was looking at him now directly, with the expression of a person who has received unexpected information and has not yet decided what to do with it. Her eyes were gray-blue, the color the sky goes before rain, and they were not soft eyes, not frightened eyes. They were eyes that had been watching things carefully for a long time and had gotten good at it. $50? Yes, he said again. Cash. The silence lasted 3 seconds, which is a long time for a crowd to be silent. $50, Simmons said in the automatic way of a man whose professional habits take over when he is uncertain. Do I hear more than 50? No one spoke. Priest's jaw moved. Something in his calculation was being revised, and the revision did not please him, but he was too careful a man to show displeasure in public, when he could not immediately follow it with action. He smoothed the front of his coat. He nodded at Simmons. Sold, Simmons said, and brought down the gavel, and the sound of it was the loudest thing in the square. What happened next was managed with the particular efficiency of a man who had arranged the morning, and was not going to allow it to become disordered. Priest spoke to Simmons in a low voice. Simmons made notes. Reuben Marr counted $50 from a money pouch he produced from his inside coat pocket, and laid the bills on the small table beside the platform with no ceremony whatsoever. Priest examined the bills as if considering whether to object, decided not to, and turned to the crowd. This is a Christian matrimonial arrangement, he said in a voice that was loud enough to be a statement of public record. The lady goes with Mr. Mare as a bride-to-be, not as property. They will present themselves to the pastor within 30 days. There was murmuring. There was always murmuring. Priest let it run its course. Ingrid climbed down from the platform. She did it herself without waiting for assistance, stepping carefully on the pine boards with their new nails catching the light. When she reached the ground, she straightened up and turned, and Reuben Mare was standing 3 feet away from her, not quite close enough to be imposing, far enough to make it clear he was not going to grab her arm. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a considerable amount that needed to be said, logistically speaking, and neither of them said any of it there. He turned toward the edge of the square, and after a moment she followed him, and the crowd watched them go, and began to make of it what it would make of it, which would keep people talking for at least a week, and would not resemble the truth very closely, as was typical. He had arranged for a wagon from the livery. She had brought nothing from her house, no bag, no bundle, because she had not known until this morning that she was leaving it, and there had been no time to go back, and she was not going to ask him to take her. She climbed up onto the wagon seat without assistance. He tied his horse to the back, checked the hitch, and climbed up beside her. They drove out of Harrow's Crossing without speaking. The road north into the mountains was one she knew for the first few miles, and then did not know at all. The wagon wheels found every rock and root in the frozen track. The cold came off the mountains in waves, not violent, just steady, the patient cold of elevation and open sky. Beside her, Reuben Mare drove with the economy of movement of a man who had been doing physical things for a long time, and had learned to do them without wasting effort. His hands on the reins were large and brown and scarred in multiple places, the work of a life spent outdoors with tools. She looked at his hands briefly and then looked at the road. She did not ask his name. He had said it in the square, or Priest had said it, Mare. And she had the first name from overhearing something in the crowd. Reuben, a name that sounded like it came from a Bible, which was appropriate for a man who had appeared at the most biblical moment of her recent life and said $50 without apparent calculation. He did not explain himself. He did not make conversation. He watched the road. The track climbed steadily. The last of the town fell away behind them, and there was only the road and the mountains and the sound of the wagon and the horse and the other horse following behind and the wind in the dry grass that had gone the color of old straw. On either side of the path, an eagle moved overhead, riding a current she couldn't feel from ground level, turning slow circles against the gray sky. She watched it until it was gone. She thought $50 is a great deal of money. She thought, I do not know this man. She thought, I have been in worse situations, which was not entirely true, but was the kind of thing a person tells herself in the interest of continuing to function. She thought about her mother's book, left on the shelf in the house. She should have taken it. She had not known she was leaving. She pushed the thought aside. It would still be there. Books did not go anywhere. After perhaps an hour on the road, the track turned and the valley opened up below them on the left. Vast and pale and fringed with the dark line of the lodgepole pines, and the mountains above were beginning to show the white they would keep through the winter. She had not been this far up before. She looked at the valley and thought that it was, regardless of everything else that was true this morning, a very beautiful place. The cabin came into view another 20 minutes later, set into the side of the hill with its back to the slope, sheltered from the worst of the north wind by the ridge above it. It was not large. It was solidly built, the logs fitted well, the chinking fresh, a good stone chimney. There was a horse pen with a shed attached a wood store, stacked high with split wood. A root cellar door set into the hillside. A well, a chicken shed, though she could not see any chickens from the road, and suspected they were somewhere else, or were not in good health. Reuben brought the wagon to a stop. He climbed down and went to unhitch his horse, moving with the practiced sequence of a man who had done this particular set of actions many hundreds of times and no longer needed to think about them. She climbed down from her side. She stood on the ground in front of the cabin. The door was a good door, made of thick pine planks with iron hinges that were not rusted. There was a wooden step in front of it, worn smooth in the center. She stood on the ground and looked at the door and waited. Reuben came around from the horses and walked past her. He put his hand on the door latch and pushed it open. Then he stood to the side, holding it open, not looking at her, giving her room. She walked forward. At the threshold, she stopped. Left foot forward. Half a second. The pause that was not a pause, but a question. Her body asked automatically every time before every door. A question that translated roughly as whether she was allowed to be here, whether this was a space that would accept her or reject her, whether she was about to be wrong about something again. He saw it. She saw him see it in the small shift of his attention, the slight change in how he was standing. She felt her face do something involuntary and controlled it before it finished, but he did not comment. He did not make a face or ask what she was doing. He stepped through the door ahead of her, picked up the matchbox from the shelf beside the door and lit the lamp. The light came up slowly, filling the room from the center, and he moved around the room with the lamp and lit the second one on the far wall, and then set both in their places. "The bed is yours," he said, without looking at her. "I sleep by the fire." She came through the door. The room was one main space with a smaller room at the back that was clearly the bedroom. The main room had a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a set of shelves along one wall, a cooking area with a good iron stove, and a rack for pots. The floor was wooden, planed flat, and swept clean. There was a window on the south wall that looked out over the valley. There was a braided rug in front of the fireplace, made from what looked like old coats. It was a room that had been lived in alone for a long time. She could tell from the arrangement of things the single-person logic of where objects had been placed, everything at arm's reach for one person, moving through the same patterns every day. But it was not a dirty room or a disordered one. It was the room of a man who was solitary, but not slovenly, which she found she was glad of. On the shelves among the tins and tools and folded papers she saw it. A wooden embroidery frame, perhaps 10 inches across, leaning against the shelf wall. The fabric stretched across it was cream-colored linen, and on it was the beginning of an embroidered pattern, flowers of some kind, rendered in blue and green thread, perhaps a quarter of the way finished. The needle was still stuck through the fabric at the point where the work had stopped. The thread was still attached. She looked at it. She looked at it long enough that she could not pretend she had not. She moved her eyes away. She looked at the window. Outside, the sky was going from gray to the darker gray of approaching evening, the mountains becoming silhouettes against it. She heard him behind her. She turned her head enough to see that he had looked at the embroidery frame and then looked away in the direction of the fireplace. He crouched in front of the fireplace and began building the fire, stacking the smaller wood, first, then the larger pieces, with the efficient attention of a man who thinks about fires the way other people think about meals, as a necessary thing that requires doing correctly. He did not speak. She did not speak. The fire caught and began to build, and the warmth moved out from it in small, exploratory waves. She sat down in one of the chairs at the table. She sat there while the room got darker outside and warmer inside, while the fire established itself, while the lamp on the shelf kept its quiet light. She sat, and she was very tired, and she did not sleep. He made supper from what he had, which was salt pork, and cornmeal and dried beans he had soaked that morning before he left for town. Reheated now in the pot, simple and hot and filling. He put a bowl in front of her and sat down with his own across the table, and they ate in silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who have arrived at the same place from very different directions and have not yet worked out what to do about the fact. She washed the bowls after. He banked the fire. He laid out his blankets beside the fireplace with no comment. Just the practical arrangement of a man settling in for the night, and she went into the back room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and listened to the sounds of the cabin, settling around her, and the sounds of the mountains outside, which were quite different from the sounds of the house she had grown up in. The wind up here was different, lower, slower. It moved around the cabin, the way water moves around a stone, finding the gaps and the edges, not threatening so much as thorough. She thought $50. She thought, what does he want in return? She thought, there is a half-finished embroidery on his shelf, and there has been no woman here in a long time, by the look of things, and whatever that means, it means something. She thought, I have my mother's book on a shelf in a house I may not return to, and that troubles me more than any of the rest of it right now. She lay down on top of the blanket, not under it. She kept her dress on. She stared at the ceiling, which she could not see in the dark, which was just the darkness of a place where the ceiling was. In the main room on the other side of the wall, she could hear him. He was not asleep either. She could tell from the quality of the silence, the way a person's silence sounds different when they are lying awake rather than sleeping, some frequency in the breathing, something in the absence of sound that has a kind of attention to it. The fire popped. The wind moved around the cabin. Neither of them slept for a very long time. Morning came into the cabin slowly. The window in the main room faced south and east, and the first light came through it at an angle, laying a pale rectangle across the floor, that moved as the sun climbed, crossing the braided rug and reaching the leg of the table while the rest of the room was still dim. Ingrid was already awake. She had slept eventually, in the way you sleep when you are exhausted, past the point where anxiety can sustain itself, dropping into a few hours of dreamless dark that was more collapse than rest. She had woken before the light and lain still for a moment, listening, establishing where she was and what was true. A cabin. A mountain. Montana. A man sleeping on the other side of a wall. She sat up. She straightened her dress, which had creased badly from being slept in. She smoothed her hair as best she could without a mirror and pinned it. She put on her shoes and stood up and stood there for a moment in the cold of the back room taking stock. She was hungry. She was cold. She needed, practically speaking, to find out what was in the kitchen. She pushed open the door between the rooms. Reuben was asleep by the fire on his side, his blanket pulled up. He breathed evenly. She looked at him for only a second, which was long enough to confirm that he was genuinely asleep and not performing it. And then she moved quietly to the cooking area and began to examine what was available. The stove was a good one, a cast-iron range, and there was wood stacked in the box beside it. She opened the firebox, checked the coals from the night before, found them still holding a faint heat, and built the fire up with small pieces, first the way her mother had taught her. The iron ticked and expanded as it warmed. She looked through the shelves. There was flour, a good amount of it, in a sealed tin. Salt. The remains of the lard in a pottery crock. A smaller tin that turned out to contain baking powder when she pried the lid up. There was cornmeal and dried beans and dried peas and a string of onions hanging from a hook above the window and several jars of preserved things she could not immediately identify in the low light. She took the flour and the salt and the lard and made flatbread. It was the bread her mother had made every morning of Ingrid's childhood, shaped into rounds and cooked on a hot iron skillet, neither fancy nor complicated, only requiring the right hand for the dough, which Ingrid had developed over many years of repetition. She mixed the dough in the largest bowl she could find, a good ceramic bowl with a chipped rim that had been used a great many times. She shaped the rounds. She set the skillet on the stove and waited for it to be hot enough the way you test cast iron, holding your palm a few inches above the surface and counting. The bread went on. The smell of it filled the room within minutes. Hot iron and flour and the faint sweetness of the lard. The smell that was for Ingrid so deeply associated with her mother's kitchen, that for a moment, standing alone at a stranger's stove in a mountain cabin, she had arrived at yesterday against her will. She felt an entirely unexpected rush of something that was not quite grief and not quite comfort, but lived somewhere between the two. She heard him wake up behind her, not dramatically. He did not say anything or make a sudden movement. He simply went from the quality of stillness that meant sleep to the quality of stillness that meant wakefulness. And then she heard the blanket move and the sound of him sitting up. She did not turn around. She flipped the bread. He sat at the table. She could hear the chair. She heard him pull on his boots, then silence. She put the finished rounds on the tin plate she had found and set them on the table and sat down across from him with her own. He looked at the bread. He looked at her. He did not say thank you. He picked up a round and ate it. He ate his portion, and then, without any discussion, ate the second round she had left in the center of the plate, which she had put there, not because she was not hungry, but because she had not known whether the portions were appropriate, and had hedged. He ate it with the same efficiency with which he had eaten supper the night before, not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. A man fueling himself for a day's work. When he was done, he put his hands flat on the table and said, "I go out at first light. I'll be back by midday." Maybe before. She nodded. "There's a lock on the door," he said. "Inside bolt. Use it. Is there something to use it against?" He considered this. "Probably not, but it's a habit." "Then I'll use it," she said. He stood up. He put on his coat and his hat and took his rifle from the rack by the door. He opened the door and stopped as if he had remembered something, and then said without turning, "The well has a good rope. Don't let it fray on the edge." Then he was gone, and the door was shut. and she was alone in the cabin with the smell of the bread and the sound of the stove ticking and the light coming through the south window. She sat at the table for a few minutes, then she got up and bolted the door and went to work. The days began to take on a shape. He left early. She used the time alone to learn the cabin, which had the logic of a person who had thought about what was needed and had arranged things accordingly, but who had also developed certain habits that were entirely personal and did not explain themselves. The firewood was stacked in a particular order she could not at first decipher, and then realized was by density and burning time. The hardest wood at the back, the softer pieces at the front. The tools were arranged on their hooks by frequency of use. The food stores were organized with the oldest things at the front, which was sensible, and the things he used most often at eye level, which told her what he ate and did not eat. He ate plainly. He ate to work. He did not have anything that suggested he cooked for pleasure. She began to cook for pleasure. Not extravagantly, because the pantry did not contain the materials for extravagance, but with attention, with the particular investment of a woman who genuinely loved feeding people and had not had many people to feed. She made a proper bean soup with the onions and dried herbs she found in a small paper packet at the back of the shelf. Labeled in a handwriting she did not recognize as his, which meant someone else had stocked that shelf at some point, and she did not ask about it. She made cornbread with a sweetness in it from a small amount of the honey she found in a sealed jar. She roasted the dried peas with salt in the iron skillet until they were something worth eating. He ate what she made without comment, but he ate all of it every time, and once he looked at the empty pot with an expression she interpreted as something between appreciation and surprise, quickly covered, and she filed that away. He came back the second day with 2 rabbits cleaned and ready, and left them on the table without a word. Which she understood was not indifference, but the communication system of a man who had lived alone so long that he had forgotten the conventions for saying things like, "This is my contribution, and I appreciate yours." She made a stew. On the 3rd day he showed her the property. He did it practically walking the perimeter as if she were a new ranch hand who needed to know the boundaries, pointing out the well and the root cellar and the wood store and the small creek that ran 30 yards east of the cabin and was the water source in summer when the well ran low. He showed her where the beavers had dammed the creek lower down and said they were useful because they kept the water level stable. He pointed up the slope and indicated the direction of his trap line, which ran 3 miles into the mountains, following game trails he knew well enough to walk in the dark. She listened. She asked practical questions. He answered them. She noticed that he pointed out the plants she was likely to find as they walked, not because he had identified her as someone who would be interested, but because it was his habit to notice things and annotate them. He knew the names of most of what grew here, in the way that men who spent significant time outdoors often did. Practically, rather than botanically, by use rather than by genus. She knew more than he did, and she did not say so. She let him explain and asked questions about things she already knew the answers to, because listening to what someone chooses to tell you is often more informative than what you could learn by talking. On the 5th day, she told him about the yarrow. She had found a good patch of it 3 days earlier, dried but intact, sheltered by a boulder on the south-facing slope above the cabin, still holding most of its potency. She told him where it was and what it was good for, speaking in the practical way he seemed to prefer without embellishment. He listened. "You know plants," he said. "My mother knew plants. I learned what she knew." He nodded. He did not say anything else about it. But 2 days later, he brought back a handful of something she had not noticed on her walks. Dried pods she recognized immediately as wild ginger, rarer than the yarrow, and left them on the table the same way he left the rabbits without ceremony. She put them in the paper packet with the other herbs and added a note in pencil on the outside. They were not yet easy with each other. That would be the wrong word. But they were building a vocabulary of practical exchange, a language of tasks completed and information shared, and small considerations enacted without being named. And the vocabulary was growing day by day. On the 9th day, Gris came up lame. Gris was the horse, a grey dun gelding of perhaps 12 years solid, and experienced the kind of horse that has stopped being surprised by anything. Reuben had gone to saddle him that morning, and had come back inside without the horse, and his face had the particular flatness of a man receiving bad news he had been hoping to avoid. "His front left," he said. She put down what she was doing. "Can I look at him?" He led her to the horse pen. The gelding was standing with his weight off the left foreleg, which was a clear enough sign. And when Ingrid crouched and ran her hands down the leg from knee to fetlock, she found the place where the skin had been broken. A ragged wound in the fetlock, the edges already showing the early signs of infection, a heat to it and a smell that she recognized. "He caught something," she said, "a trap wire from the look of it. Titeti. There are traps down by the creek that aren't mine. Beavers." "Not a beaver trap, something smaller." She pressed carefully around the wound. The horse shifted but did not kick. "It's early enough. A few more days and it would be worse. Can you do something for it?" She sat back on her heels. "I need yarrow. Do you have clean cloth and vinegar?" "I have vinegar. Cloth I can find." She stood and went inside, and got her bag, the one she had thought to bring from the house the morning of the auction, because it was always by the door, always ready, the habit of a woman who might be sent for at any hour. She went up the slope to the yarrow patch and gathered what she needed enough to make a good poultice, and brought it back. She worked in the pen, kneeling in the hay with the cold coming off the ground through her skirt, while Reuben stood beside the horse's head, one hand on the halter, keeping him calm in the way of a man who was very good with animals, quiet and present and entirely without urgency. She cleaned the wound with the vinegar she had diluted in water from the well, working carefully, flushing the edges. She dried it. She packed the yarrow into the cloth and wrapped it securely, tying it in the way her mother had taught her for wounds on animals, the knots that would hold through movement but not cut in. She said, 3 days, if you leave the wrapping and don't let him stand in mud." Reuben looked down at the work she had done. He was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. It was not a question. Animals are not so different from people. The infections work the same. The herbs don't know the difference. The smell of the vinegar was sharp in the cold air, and the yarrow had its own smell, dry and slightly bitter, and she was aware of his presence next to her very clearly, the warmth of a large body nearby in the cold, the sound of his breathing. She finished tying the bandage and sat back. 3 days, she said again. Keep him quiet. She stood up, brushing the hay from her skirt, and when she straightened, she found that he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not gratitude exactly, more like recognition, the look of a person who has seen something confirmed that they had suspected, but had not been entirely certain of. He looked away first. "Thank you," he said. She picked up her bag. "He's a good horse," she said. "He deserves the trouble, Iki." 3 days later, on a morning that was bright and very cold, with the light coming hard off the snow on the peaks above Gris, stood evenly on all 4 feet. Reuben checked the leg, then stood back and watched the horse cross the pen once, twice, with his usual deliberate, grounded walk. Ingrid was standing at the fence. She had come out because she wanted to see, and because the morning was too beautiful to stay inside in spite of the cold. The sky was the particular deep blue that appears on clear days at altitude, and the mountains above them were white down to the tree line, and the air was the kind of air that makes everything feel precise and possible. Reuben watched the horse for another minute. Then he came and stood beside her at the fence and also watched. Grizz had found a section of the fence to examine with interest, as horses do, as if fences were a topic they had ongoing concerns about. "There," Reuben said quietly. "There," she agreed. The wind moved through the dry grass. Grizz blew through his nose and shook his head, which was as close as he was likely to come to expressing satisfaction. After a while, Reuben said, "Thank you. He had said it 3 days ago. He said it again now differently. The first time it had been practical, the acknowledgement of a service rendered. This time it had something beneath it, some weight that was not about the horse specifically, or not only." She nodded. Their shoulders were perhaps 8 inches apart. She was aware of the distance in the way you become aware of the distance between things when you have been living in a small space with another person and have developed, without meaning, to a sense of where they are in relation to you at most times. They stood there for another minute. Neither of them moved. That evening he built a fire outside instead of inside a small fire in the ring of stones she had noticed, but not asked about. She brought out the 2 cups of tea she had made on the stove and put one beside him where he sat on the log he used as a seat, and she sat down on the other side. The fire was small and clean. The mountains above were invisible now, absorbed into the dark sky, and the stars were extraordinary at this altitude, thick and overlapping the Milky Way, an actual band of light rather than an abstraction. She had her mother's book in her lap. She had her mother's book because Reuben had gone down to Harrow's Crossing 3 days after they arrived for the salt. He had not finished getting on the day of the auction, and she had asked him carefully to see if someone could retrieve the book from the house, and he had come back with the book, and with August, the mule, who was now in the pen with Grizz and had already begun the process of becoming Grizz's primary concern. She had not expected the mule. She had not asked for the mule. She had not said anything about the mule when he brought it, and he had not explained, just led it to the pen, and seen to the bad hoof, which had in fact required fairly significant attention, and that was that. She opened the book to the page her mother had written. The firelight was enough to read by barely. "What does it say?" he asked. She had not known he was looking. She read the Norwegian first quietly, and then said every plant has its place, even the ones that grow on stone. The fire moved. He was quiet. "Celeste used to say something like that," he said. He was looking at the fire when he said it. "My wife." The name sat in the air. "She's gone," Ingrid said. 5 years. She waited to see if there was more. There was not in words. But he did not stand up. He did not find a reason to be somewhere else. He sat with the fire between them and the mountains dark above, and he stayed. And she thought that for a man who had been alone for 5 years, staying was not a small thing. She looked at the stars. She thought about Celeste, whoever she had been, who had left a half-finished piece of embroidery on a shelf in a mountain cabin, and a name that a man said once in 5 years and did not say again. She thought about the kind of grief that does not diminish so much as it becomes part of the landscape, something you live inside rather than carry. She understood that kind of grief. She had her own version of it, smaller, differently shaped. Not a person lost, but a life that had never started. A series of doors she had stood in front of and not walked through, waiting for permission that had never come. They sat until the fire went low. A week later, she was making bread. Proper bread this time, with the sourdough starter she had coaxed to life in a ceramic crock. Over several days, fed with flour and water, until it had developed the right smell, active and slightly sour, the smell of something alive and useful. The dough was ready, and she was working it on the floured board she had found under the table, pushing and folding with the heels of her hands, the motion as familiar to her as breathing. Reuben was at the table across from her working on a trap. He had several laid out on the oilcloth he put down for the purpose, and he was checking the springs and the triggers with the methodical attention of someone performing a regular maintenance task. The sound was a series of small metallic clicks and the occasional scrape of metal on metal. She said without looking up from the dough, "I delivered 6 babies in this county. Nobody thought to ask me that at the auction." "Bekasi." The clicking stopped. "I know," he said. She looked up. He had put down the trap. He was looking at her steadily. "How?" she said. "Martha Gould told me. First week I was back in town. I was at the trading post, and she was there, and she told me about the woman who had come in the night and delivered her boy in February. She said it was Ingrid Voss from the Voss place, Lars Voss's girl. And she said the doctor hadn't answered his door. And Ingrid Voss had." She was still looking at him. Her hands had stopped moving in the dough. "You already knew," she said. It was not quite a question. "It's why I stayed to watch," he said. She understood then, or she began to understand, which is different. She had thought in the days since the auction that he had acted on something she could not identify, some impulse or instinct, something that had nothing to do with her specifically. People sometimes did things that appeared connected to you that were actually about entirely other matters, and she had learned to be careful about reading intention into kindness. But he had known about her before. He had known what she did, what she was capable of. He had known, and he had stayed. She looked back down at the dough. She pressed the heels of her hands into it and pushed. "Martha's boy," she said. "Thomas, did she say how he was getting on?" "She said he was fat and loud," Reuben said. She seemed pleased about it. Ingrid laughed. It was a small laugh, brief, surprised out of her, and it sounded strange in her own ears because she had not heard herself laugh in some time. He looked at her when she laughed. She did not see it because she was looking at the dough, but she felt it, the way you feel when someone's attention shifts in your direction. The days continued. There was an afternoon when she was looking through what remained in the root cellar and found behind the bins of potatoes and the crates of dried corn a box she had not seen before. She pulled it out carefully. It was a wooden box, small with a simple clasp, and inside it was a set of embroidery threads, the colors still vivid, despite the time they had sat in the dark. Blue and green and gold and cream. Exactly the colors in the unfinished piece on the shelf. She stood in the root cellar for a moment. Then she closed the box and put it back exactly where she had found it. She did not take the threads out, and she did not touch the frame on the shelf. But she thought about it for several days, about the person who had left the threads in the box, and the work unfinished on the frame, about the fact that Reuben had not put them away, not in 5 years, which said something she could not quite name. The evenings were the best part of the days now. That surprised her. She had expected the evenings to be the worst of it, the long hours between supper and sleep, when there was nothing to do but be aware of the situation she was in. But the evenings were quiet in a way that had stopped feeling like confinement and started feeling cautiously like something else. He read. He had more books than she had expected, a small collection on the lower shelf. Mostly practical things, a surveying manual, a volume on animal medicine that she had borrowed and read cover to cover, 2 novels she had not recognized, one of which she had picked up one evening and he had said nothing about, and which she was working through slowly in the evenings, reading it in the lamplight while he worked on whatever needed working on. They talked sometimes, not a great deal, Not in the way of people trying to fill silence, but in the way of people who have accepted the silence and are occasionally moved to contribute something to it. He told her once about a winter he had spent entirely alone on the mountain when the pass had closed early and he had not been able to get down, and how he had tracked a mountain lion for 3 weeks without ever seeing it, only its prints. She told him about the first birth she had attended alone when she was 19, and the woman had been very frightened, and Ingrid had been frightened too, but had not let it show, and the child had been born healthy. And Ingrid had walked home afterward, through the summer dark, feeling something she could not name, something like having been trusted with something important and not having dropped it. He had listened to that story, in the way he listened to most things, with his full attention, and no comment until she had finished, and then he said, "That's a hard thing to carry alone." And she had thought about it, and said yes, it was, and they had left it there. The evening she would think about afterward, the one that was the still point of those weeks, before everything shifted, was a Tuesday night in early November, when the first real cold had come down off the mountains, and she had finally conceded that she needed to wear his extra coat when she went outside, which he had left on the hook by the door without commenting on why it was there. She was mending his other coat. The sleeve had torn at the seam when he caught it on a nail, fixing the roof of the horse shed, a clean enough tear that wanted only restitching. She had found his sewing kit, a practical man's collection of needles and heavy thread, and she was working on it in the lamplight while he sat across the table with his survey maps, the ones he used to plan where to run his lines in the spring. The fire was warm. Outside the wind was up, moving hard off the peaks, but the cabin was tightly chinked and held the heat well. Breeze was audible through the wall, the occasional shifting of hooves on straw, the sound that means an animal is comfortable and settled. She worked the needle through the heavy canvas and drew the thread through and worked it back. The lamp put a yellow circle of light on the table between them. She thought this is what it was supposed to be like. The thought came in without permission, clear and simple, and she let it rest there for a moment before putting it carefully aside. This is what she had seen in the households she went to for births, the ones where the marriage was good, the particular quality of 2 people in a room together without the need for performance, the ease of proximity between people who have agreed without saying so to trust each other with their ordinary selves. It was a dangerous thought. She knew it was dangerous. She had been in this cabin for 3 weeks, and she did not know him well, not truly, not the way you know a person after years. She knew what he did and how he moved and some of what had happened to him. She did not know what he wanted, what he thought about her, what he intended. She did not let the thought go further than that. Reuben set down his map. He looked out the window at the dark. He was very still for a moment, in the way he sometimes became still, a particular quality of attention that meant he was listening for something. Then she heard it too, hoofbeats, coming fast up the road from below, not the slow walk of someone making a normal approach, but the driven rhythm of a horse being pushed. Reuben was already on his feet. He had his coat on before she could put down the mending. He took the rifle from the rack beside the door and went outside, pulling the door nearly shut behind him, and she sat in the lamplight, with the half-mended coat in her lap, and listened to the hoofbeats slow and stop outside, listened to the murmur of voices, one of which she recognized before she could place it. A voice she had known all her life, lower now than it had been when they were children, worn down by years and weather and the particular quality of a man who has made too many wrong decisions and learned to carry them horizontally across the shoulders, rather than processing them through. Eric. She put the coat on the table. She stood up. She did not go to the door. She stood in the middle of the room and waited, because going to the door would have been a kind of admission that she was afraid, and she was not afraid. She was tired, and tired was different. The door opened. Reuben came in first, and his face had the particular flatness she had come to associate with him receiving information he found unpleasant. Not anger, exactly more like the deliberate suppression of a response that would not be useful. He held the door, and Ingrid Voss came in behind him. Her brother looked the way he always looked, which was to say he looked like a man who had meant to do better and hadn't, and had stopped being surprised by this about himself, but had not stopped being diminished by it. He was wearing his good hat, which he only put on when he was going somewhere he thought required impressing, and his coat was buttoned wrong. One button off at the bottom, which meant he had dressed in a hurry, or in the dark, or in a state of some agitation. He held his hat in his hands when he saw her. He looked at the floor. He said, "Priest is saying you stole her mar, and I need 50 more. $50 more, or I go to the sheriff." The silence that followed was the kind of silence a room produces when something has been said that is so wrong in so many directions at once that no immediate response presents itself. Ingrid looked at her brother. She looked at the top of his hat, which he was turning in his hands. She looked at his boots, which needed new soles. She thought about every morning of the last year she had spent in that house that had been their father's house, every cord of wood she had split, and every jar she had put up, and every night she had sat alone in that kitchen with the lamp and the book. And she thought about the morning he had laid the paper on the table and not answered her question. Reuben was looking at Eric with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not fury, nothing as loud as fury. Something colder and more certain. "You sold your sister for a debt," he said. "Now you're selling her again." Eric's jaw moved. He did not look up from the floor. He did not say anything for a moment, and in that moment Ingrid understood that he had come here knowing what he was doing was wrong, and had come anyway because whatever he was afraid of from Priest was larger to him than what he was willing to be to her, and that this was not new information about her brother, only a clarification of something she had known for a long time. "Priest says the arrangement wasn't proper," Eric said. "He says he can make trouble." "Priest says a number of things," Reuben said. "Most of them are designed to make other people afraid. Are you afraid of Harlow, Priest, Voss, Price?" Eric looked up then. He looked at Reuben and then at Ingrid, and she could see that he was in fact afraid, and that the fear had made him smaller than he already was, and she felt something complex about that. Something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but lived in the uncomfortable space between them. She was standing behind the table near the stove, and she had picked up the handle of the bread knife without thinking about it, not to use it only because her hands needed something to hold, the way they did in difficult moments, and because it was there. "I'll need to think on it," Reuben said to Eric, in a tone that meant the conversation was over for the moment. "Ride back. I'll send word." Eric looked at his sister one more time. She looked back at him. There was a great deal that could have been said. She had a gift for words in the privacy of her own mind, whole speeches assembled in the quiet hours of the night, clear and precise, every true thing said in the right order. She said none of them. She looked at her brother, and she let him see that she had seen what he had done, fully and without confusion. And that was enough. He put his hat back on. He went out. They heard his horse move away down the road, slower than it had come, and then the sound of it was absorbed by the wind and the dark. Reuben closed the door. He stood with his back to her for a moment, his hand still on the latch. "I'm sorry," he said. "He's my brother," she said. "I'm sorry, too." He turned around. He looked at her hands, and she realized she was still holding the knife handle and put it down. "Priest will make trouble regardless," she said. "He doesn't need Eric to make trouble." "No," Reuben agreed. "He doesn't." He hung his coat back on the hook. He sat down at the table. After a moment, she sat down too, across from him, and they sat in the diminished warmth of the evening, the fire lower, now the lamp still steady. "What does he want?" she said. "The land," Reuben said. "He's wanted this parcel for 3 years. There's something under it, silver most likely, though he hasn't said so to my face. He's been looking for a way to take it since the survey last spring. And I'm the way. You were a way," he said. "I'm not going to let you be." She looked at him. She had learned over these weeks to read the small vocabulary of his face, which did not say much, but said what it said precisely. He was not making a promise casually. He was not the kind of man who made casual promises. "He'll go to the sheriff in Carmody," she said. "That's the next county. Halverson will help," he said. "He already knows the situation. He'll gather what's needed." She thought about Muksu Halverson, the Lutheran pastor, who had known her family since her parents had arrived in Montana, who had conducted her father's burial in February, standing in the frozen ground with his breath making clouds in the cold air, and his voice steady, because that was who he was, a man whose voice was steady when it needed to be. She thought that Halverson was the kind of man who would in fact help. "And Eric," she said. Reuben looked at the table. "Your brother will have to decide who he is," he said. "I can't decide that for him." She nodded. That was true. It was also true that she had been waiting for Eric to decide who he was for most of her adult life, and that he kept deciding in the same direction, and that she was going to have to stop being surprised by it. She picked up the mending from where she had laid it on the table. She looked at the half-finished seam. She put it down again. "Why did you buy me?" she said. She had not meant to ask it tonight. She had meant to continue not asking it in the way she had been not asking it for 3 weeks, storing the question behind the same door where she kept the other things that were too large for ordinary hours. But it came out plain and direct the way things do when you have held them long enough. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you stopped at the door," he said. She looked at him. "What's on the platform?" Dunmore said what he said, and the crowd was laughing and your foot moved. You were going to step back or step forward some direction, and then you stopped. Like you'd remembered you weren't allowed. She was very still. "You always stop before you step through a door," he said. "Any door. You always put your left foot forward and then you stop, like you're asking permission to exist." The fire made a sound. Outside, the wind ran along the side of the cabin and went on. "Nobody noticed that," she said. Her voice was even. She made it even. "I did," he said. She looked at the table. She looked at the lamp. She thought about every door she had ever stood in front of, every threshold. She had paused at every room she had entered. Half a second later than she might have the habit. So old, she had stopped being aware of it, so embedded in the way she moved through the world that she had thought of it on the rare occasions she thought of it at all, as simply the way she was a quirk of her particular nature. She had never thought of it as a thing someone might see. She had never thought of it as a thing worth seeing. "I'll need to go down to see Halverson," Reuben said, after the silence had run its course. "Tomorrow or the next day. I'd like you to come. Publicly." She understood what he meant. Publicly, in daylight together. Not hiding, not managing the situation from a distance. Going directly at it, which was his way she had come to learn. He did not go around things when he could go through them. "All right," she said. She picked up the mending and finished the seam that evening while the fire burned down, and she did it well because she did things well when she did them. And Reuben sat across from her with his maps and said nothing more, and the lamp burned until they were both tired enough to sleep. The morning they went down to Harrow's Crossing, it was clear and very cold. The kind of cold that arrives in November, like a statement unambiguous, informing the landscape of what is coming and what will be required. The road was frozen hard, and the horses moved well on it, their breath making steady plumes. Ingrid wore the extra coat over her blue dress because it was the warmest thing available, and the coat was large on her. But it was warm, and she had stopped apologizing for practical decisions. They came into Harrow's Crossing from the north, which meant they passed the feed barn first, and then the back of the saloon, and then came around to the main street and the square, and she could see, even before they were fully in view, that something had been arranged. Harlow Priest was in the square. He was standing near the center of it, near the platform that his men had not yet taken down. And he was not alone. Eric was there to the left and slightly behind Priest, with the posture of a man who has agreed to be somewhere, and has already begun to regret it. There were 5 or 6 other men she recognized from the auction, Dunmore among them, Carl Bricks, Pete Sallow, standing in the loose configuration of men who have been gathered with a purpose. And there were townspeople, not as many as the day of the auction, but enough. Women on the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store, men outside the saloon, the boy who swept out Alderman's trading post standing in the doorway, watching. Priest had known they were coming. She did not know how. It did not matter. Reuben brought the horses to a stop at the edge of the square. He climbed down, and she climbed down beside him, and he did not tell her to stay back, and she did not offer to, and they walked together into the square. Priest came forward. He was wearing his good coat, the church coat, which meant he considered this an occasion. His face was composed in the expression he used for official business. Reasonable and patient, the face of a man who is being very forbearing about something. "Good of you to come down, Mare," he said, "and Miss Voss." "Mrs. Marr," Reuben said. That was not yet true, precisely, and they both knew it, and Priest knew it, and the crowd heard it, and would remember it. Priest let it go for the moment. "The matter of the matrimonial arrangement," he said loud enough that the boardwalk could hear, "has not been properly settled. There are questions about the legitimacy of the transfer, questions about the circumstances," he paused, "questions about whether Miss Voss was in a condition to consent to any arrangement at all, given the pressure being applied by various parties." He said it with real skill. He was good at this, at making the person he was wronging sound like the problem. "I believe," Priest continued, turning slightly to address the watching crowd, as much as Reuben, "that in the interest of the community and in the interest of the young woman's well-being, she ought to return to town and allow the matter to be reviewed properly by appropriate authorities." He extended his hand toward Ingrid. "Come along now, girl," he said. "You know where you belong." Everything in the square went very quiet. Not the quiet of disinterest, the quiet of a gathering that has leaned in. Reuben took one step forward, just one step. He moved between Ingrid and Priest's extended hand, and the step was not hurried, and it was not dramatic. It was simply the movement of a large man relocating himself to where he had decided he needed to be. And when it was done, Priest's hand was pointing at no one in particular, and Reuben was standing in the space between them. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was not raised. He had no need to raise it. "I outbid every man in this square," he said. "I paid what was asked, the money was accepted, the arrangement was declared before witnesses." He paused. "And I am telling you now, and I am telling every soul standing here." He turned. He looked at the crowd on the boardwalk. He looked at the men standing behind Priest. He looked at Eric Voss, who was looking at the ground. He looked at Dunmore, who had made the mule joke, and at Greer, who had started at $8, and at Carl Bricks and Pete Sallow, and the boy in the doorway of the trading post, and the women outside the dry goods store, one by one, unhurried, a man who had decided something and was making it plain. "No one touches her." 3 words. Not a shout, not a declaration performed for effect. 3 words said at the volume of a man stating a fact he has already decided is true and does not expect to need to repeat. Harlow Priest stood with his hand still slightly extended, and the hand did not move toward Ingrid, and after a moment he lowered it. The square was still. The flag above the courthouse was moving in the wind. A horse at the hitching post shifted its weight. Then Martha Gould stepped off the boardwalk. She came down the 2 steps from the dry goods store and crossed the packed dirt of the square with the deliberate pace of a woman who has made up her mind, and she came to stand beside Ingrid. She did not look at Priest. She did not say anything. She simply stood. A woman who had held Ingrid's hand in the worst hours of a February night and knew what that hand was worth, and she put that knowledge in her body and stood with it. A moment passed. Another woman stepped down from the boardwalk. Ingrid did not know her name well, only her face, a farmer's wife. From the eastern edge of the valley, a quiet woman who had sent for Ingrid 2 years ago when her daughter had been sick with a fever, and the doctor had not come for 3 days. She came and stood on Ingrid's other side. Then a third. Priest looked at the women gathering. He looked at Reuben. Something moved in his face, a revision, a calculation being updated. Ingrid was looking at Reuben's back. He was broad across the shoulders in the way of a man who has done physical work. His entire life, the canvas of his coat, pulled smooth across it. She was looking at his back, the way she had looked at the mountains on the evenings she sat with her mother's book, finding in the fact of them something she could not name but could feel. A solidity that was not about her, and did not require anything from her, that was simply there. She thought, I have not been warm in a very long time. She thought, that is not entirely true. I have been warm in that cabin for 3 weeks. She put her hand to the birthmark below her left ear and stopped herself. She lowered her hand before it finished the gesture. She did not cover it. Halverson came. He had come from the church, which was on the far side of the square, and he was walking quickly for a man of his age, his coat buttoned to the throat, carrying a paper folded in his hand. He was 60 years old and Norwegian-born, and had come to Montana in 1861. And had never once, in Ingrid's observation, failed to appear when he was needed. He stopped beside Reuben and held up the paper. I have here, Halverson said, in the carrying voice of a man who had spent 40 years making himself heard, in drafty churches, the debt record of Lars Voss. 40 acres, Harrow's Crossing, Montana Territory. The debt owed to Harlow Priest. He unfolded the paper fully and held it up so those close enough could see the figures. Paid in full. He let that sit for a moment. By Reuben Marr, he said, 3 days ago. Before any question of an auction, any arrangement at all. The land is clear. The family debt is clear. The murmur that went through the square was different from the murmur at the auction. That one had been the sound of people finding entertainment. This one was the sound of people revising their understanding of a situation. Priest's face had gone very still. Eric Voss looked up for the first time. He looked at the paper in Halverson's hand. He looked at Ingrid. His expression was one she had never seen on his face before, or had not seen in so long she had forgotten what it looked like. Something stripped of the layers of justification and resignation. He usually wore something that might have been shame if he had been capable of sustaining it. She looked back at him steadily, without anger, without comfort. Just her face looking at his, letting him see. He turned away. Priest stood with the measured composure of a man who is not going to give the crowd the satisfaction of watching him come undone. The matter of the arrangement, he said, is still a matter of record. A matrimonial arrangement requires proper sanctioning. They will present themselves to me this Saturday. Halverson said, and his voice did not invite discussion. I will conduct the ceremony. It will be witnessed and recorded. That is entirely proper and entirely sanctioned. He looked at Priest over the top of his glasses in the way of a man who has read every legal document in the county at some point and has no patience for people who rely on others not having done the same. Is there any further question? There was not a further question. Priest looked at the gathered women. He looked at Reuben. He looked at Halverson with the paper in his hand. He turned and walked away. He did not walk fast. He was too careful for that. But he walked, and the men he had brought with him followed him, and Eric went with them, not looking back. And the square began to exhale, the way a gathered crowd exhales when tension has been released. A collective softening. Reuben turned around. He looked at Ingrid. She was looking at him, the women on either side of her, the paper in Halverson's hand, the emptying square. She was taking it in, all at once, the way you take in a landscape, after a long period of looking only at the immediate ground in front of your feet, needing to reacquaint yourself with the distance. She looked at him, and she thought about the money. $200, Halverson had said. The winter's pelts, all of it, before she had arrived, before Eric had come to the cabin, before any of this had been arranged or threatened or argued over. He had gone down to clear the debt quietly, without telling her, without making it a transaction between them, without adding it to the ledger of what she owed him. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about things she was not ready to say yet. Halverson came to stand beside her. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the way he had at her father's burial, the gesture of a man who expressed comfort through contact, because words in his experience were sometimes insufficient. Saturday, he said to her, bring what you have. The Lord doesn't require finery. I have a blue dress, she said. That will do perfectly, he said. She almost smiled. Reuben was still looking at her. She looked back at him. Then Priest was beside them. He had come back not with his full company, just himself, and he positioned himself so that his words would not carry to the remaining bystanders. He stood close to Reuben and spoke at the level of a private conversation. This isn't over Mar, he said. You have land I want. A wedding doesn't change the land. Reuben looked at him. It changes a number of things, he said. Priest moved past them without another word, and Reuben watched him go. And his face was doing the thing it did when he was thinking, not showing the thinking, but present with it, computing something she was not yet privy to. She stood beside him in the cold square, with Martha Gould still nearby, and the flag moving overhead, and the afternoon light coming down flat and silver off the mountains. He'll go to Carmody, she said. The sheriff there. He already has, Reuben said. Halverson told me yesterday. Letter went 3 days ago. She looked at him. You knew. I suspected. And you still came down today. There was no benefit to waiting, he said. Waiting just let him set the terms. She thought about that. She thought about the kind of man who, when facing a threat, calculated not whether to meet it, but where and when, and at whose advantage. She thought about the debt, cleared without announcement, the letter already responded to Halverson already prepared. She thought about the rope still over his shoulder on the day of the auction. The man who had come into town for salt and rope and had ended up changing the direction of her life, not because he had planned to, but because he had paid attention and made a decision. The sheriff will come, she said. Yes, he said. He will. He said it as a fact and not a conclusion, which was how he said most things, and she heard in it no anxiety, no performance of confidence, only the steadiness of a man who had already made his plans and trusted them. The cold was sharp around them. Her feet were beginning to feel it through the soles of her shoes, the packed dirt of the square, holding the freeze below the surface even now. Martha Gould had gone back to the boardwalk, and the square had emptied to its usual mid-afternoon population, a few horses at the post, a man carrying a sack from the feed barn. "We should get back before dark," Reuben said. "Yes," she said. They walked to where the horses were tied. She put her hand on Gris's neck as she passed him the reflex of a woman who had learned that the company of horses was reliable, and Gris turned his head toward her briefly, in the way he had begun to do, acknowledging her presence with the minimal energy appropriate to a horse of his age and dignity. She mounted. He mounted. They rode out of Harrow's Crossing toward the mountains in the long light of the November afternoon. And neither of them spoke on the road, and the cold came down off the peaks in its patient way. And somewhere behind them, in the town, they were riding away from Harlow Priest was sitting in whatever room he sat in when he was planning things. And a letter was already on its way from the sheriff in Carmody. The evening felt thin in the cabin. Not cold, the fire was good, but thin in the way that evenings feel after a day that has held a great deal. She made supper without thinking much about what she was making, something hot and filling, and he ate and she ate, and they were quiet, with a different quality of quiet than usual. After supper he said, "The sheriff will want papers, land title, the debt record, witnesses who can speak to the arrangement." "Halverson has the debt record," she said. "He does, and I have the land title. And Martha Gould will speak." He paused. "Your brother might, if it comes to it." She said nothing. "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Reuben said, "only that it might be useful." She looked at the fire. She thought about Eric's face in the square, when Halverson read out the figures, the expression she had not been able to name. She thought about the fact that Eric had come to the cabin that night trying to extract more money, and that this was the same man who had held her hand for exactly 2 seconds, the morning their father died, and then asked about the debt. She thought about all of it. "I know," she said. She did not say anything more, and he did not press her. And that was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him, that he said what needed saying and then left the rest in the space between them to be picked up or not picked up according to what was actually needed. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and listened to the wind and did not sleep for a long time. The knock at the door came 4 days later. It was mid-morning, a time when unexpected knocks were unusual, and the sound of it was sharp in the quiet of the cabin. 2 hard raps with a fist, deliberate official. Reuben was already on his feet. The man at the door was not what she had expected. She had built a sheriff in her mind over the 4 days of waiting, a construction assembled from the worst possibilities, a large man with priest's patience and a legal document that could not be argued with, something that would undo what Halverson had assembled the way frost undoes a garden, quiet and complete, and not personal. Sheriff Dale Connors of Carmody County was perhaps 55, lean, with a gray mustache and the eyes of a man who had spent a long career sorting truth from performance and had gotten reasonably good at it. He wore a coat that had seen considerable use and a badge that caught the morning light when he stepped through the door. He carried his hat in his hand. He looked around the cabin once, briefly, and then looked at Reuben. "Mr. Marr," he said. "Sheriff," Reuben said. "I have a letter from Harlow Priest of Harrow's Crossing regarding a property dispute and certain allegations concerning the circumstances of a matrimonial arrangement." He said it in the tone of a man reading from a document he has already read several times and has formed a preliminary opinion about. "I understand you're aware of the nature of the complaint." "I am," Reuben said. "Come in." The sheriff came in. He looked at Ingrid, who was standing near the stove, and he nodded at her with the courtesy of a man whose mother had raised him to acknowledge the presence of women in rooms. "Ma'am," he said. "Sheriff," she said. Reuben put the papers on the table. He had arranged them over the previous days, with the unhurried methodology that characterized everything he did, laying them out, in an order that told a story. The land title first recorded and stamped, then the debt record from Halverson with the paid notation across the bottom, and Halverson's signature below it, then the receipt from the auction. Signed by Simmons, and witnessed then a letter in Halverson's handwriting that laid out the sequence of events from the pastor's perspective in the plain, factual language of a man who had written a great many church records and knew how to be precise. The sheriff sat down. He read carefully, which was promising. Men who read carefully were men who were interested in what the papers actually said, rather than in what they had expected the papers to say. He turned the land title over and examined the recording stamp on the back. He read Halverson's letter twice. Ingrid stood at the stove and kept her hands busy with the coffee pot, because her hands needed something to do, and because coffee was a reasonable thing to offer a man who had ridden from Carmody that morning. Outside, the sky was white, with the low clouds that had been building since before dawn, and the air had the particular stillness that precedes snow, a held quality, as if the world were taking a breath. The sheriff set down the last paper. He looked at Reuben, he looked at Ingrid, he looked at the table. Priest's letter alleges that the woman was acquired under duress, he said, and that the arrangement was not a legitimate matrimonial proceeding but a transaction of a less legal nature. The woman's name is Ingrid Voss, Reuben said, shortly to be Ingrid Marr. The sheriff looked at her. Miss Voss, were you under duress? She put the coffee pot down. She turned to face him fully, the way she faced things she did not intend to look away from. I was under the duress of a family debt, and a brother who chose not to argue for me, she said. That duress existed before Mr. Marr appeared. When he bid, I was not under duress from him. I have not been under duress from him since. The sheriff held her gaze for a moment. And it is your intention to proceed with the matrimonial arrangement? It is, she said. He looked at Reuben. And the land title is clear as recorded. It is. And the debt that was the basis of Priest's claim on the family. Cleared, Reuben said. Halverson has the record. The sheriff nodded slowly, the nod of a man completing a calculation he has already mostly done. He picked up the papers, aligned them, and set them back down in a neat stack. Priest's letter, he said, makes a number of allegations. Most of them are not supported by what I have in front of me. The land title is valid. The debt is resolved. The arrangement was publicly conducted and witnessed. He paused. I'll be honest with you, Marr. I've dealt with Harlow Priest before on matters of property and contract. He is not a man who loses gracefully. Disi seems ebike. No, Reuben said. He is not. Eteka. He'll find another approach, the sheriff said. I can't tell you what it will be, but this particular complaint doesn't give me grounds for any action on his behalf. He stood up. He picked up his hat. I'd advise you to keep your papers in order. They will be, Reuben said. The sheriff looked at Ingrid one more time. You have witnesses who can speak to the arrangement. If it comes to that, beyond the pastor, Martha Gould, she said, and others. He nodded. He took the coffee she poured for him and drank it standing up, which was the gesture of a man who appreciated the offer, and was mindful of his horse waiting outside in the cold. He set the cup down on the edge of the table. Saturday, you said, he said, looking at Reuben. The wedding. Saturday, Reuben confirmed. I'd suggest you not delay it, the sheriff said, and there was nothing unkind in how he said it, only practicality, the advice of a man who understood that certain facts, once established in a community, became harder to challenge. He put his hat on. He shook Reuben's hand. He nodded at Ingrid. He went out, and they heard his horse move away down the road, and then the first snow of the season began to fall quietly, without announcement, the flakes coming down so gently at first that they were almost invisible against the white sky. She stood at the window and watched it come. Behind her, Reuben was gathering the papers from the table and returning them to the leather case he kept in the chest below the window. She heard the sound of the brass clasp, the particular sound of it, which she knew now by the time of day, and the quality of the light. The way you learn the sounds of a place when you have lived in it long enough for them to become part of your inventory of the familiar. She thought about Priest, saying this isn't over. She thought about the sheriff, saying he'll find another approach. She thought about the fact that Reuben had said, "Keep your papers in order," and the sheriff had nodded, as if this were straightforward advice that a reasonable man would take, and that this exchange had apparently settled something that she had spent 4 days lying awake imagining as catastrophic. She thought it is not over. He was right about that. Priest was not a man who accepted a single defeat as a resolution. He would find the next angle, the next pressure point, the next letter to the next official in the next county over, and they would have to meet each one of those as it came, with papers in order and witnesses ready, and Halverson's precise handwriting on whatever document was required. And she thought, I can do that. It was not a thought she had expected to have. It arrived with a clarity that surprised her, not the fragile determination of a person steeling themselves against what they are afraid of, but something quieter and more durable, the simple recognition of a fact about herself that she had not previously been in a position to discover, which was that she was capable of meeting things directly, when she had something solid to stand on. She had stood in that square. She had looked at the sheriff and said her name and what she intended and had not looked away. She had held Griss's infected leg and said 3 days with the same certainty she brought to everything she knew, because she knew it. She had walked through a door she had stopped at for half a second, and she had not been wrong to do it. Reuben came to stand beside her at the window. They watched the snow come down together, the flakes thickening now, beginning to lay a thin white cover on the top rail of the fence and on the roof of the horse shed, and on the brown grass of the slope above the cabin. After a while he said, "You can go, Ingrid." She turned and looked at him. "The debt is cleared," he said. He was looking at the snow, not at her. "You owe me nothing, not the $50, not the $200, none of it. Halverson will testify to what you said to the sheriff today, that you were not under duress from me. He'll help you find a place in town if you want it." He paused. "I'm not saying this because I want you to go. I'm saying it because it's true. You came here against your will in the beginning. You should know that it doesn't have to end the same way." She looked at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the scar on his wrist visible where his sleeve had pushed up when he was handling the papers, the long, pale line of it against the darker skin of his forearm. 5 years alone. Celeste's embroidery on the shelf. The mule he had brought back from town without explanation. The money spent quietly before anyone asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "What if I don't want to go?" she said. He turned and looked at her. "Then stay," he said, "but stay because you choose to, not because you have nowhere else." She held his gaze. She thought about the question, the real question beneath it, which was not whether she had somewhere else to go, but whether she had someone she was choosing. She thought about the evenings by the fire. She thought about the night outside with the stars and her mother's book, and his voice saying Celeste used to say something like that, and then staying, not leaving, sitting with the fire between them until it went low. She thought about the way he had looked at the embroidery frame, and then away, and the box of threads still in the root cellar, and all the things that a person does not throw away, because throwing them away would require a different kind of movement through grief than the one they have chosen. She thought about the door. She thought about stopping at the door, every door, for as long as she could remember, waiting for permission. She thought about the morning of the auction, looking at herself in the small mirror, and putting her hand up to the birthmark, and then lowering it again, saying the words she did not yet fully believe. She thought about the square today. The sheriff saying her name is Ingrid Voss, and her saying shortly to be Ingrid Mare without blinking. She stood up. She crossed to the shelves. She took her mother's book from where it stood between the tin of dried beans and the surveying manual, and she carried it to the shelf on the far wall, the shelf where the embroidery frame leaned, and she set it down beside the frame, the green cover of the book against the pale linen of the unfinished work. She stepped back and looked at them, side by side. "I'll need more shelf space," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard it. The sound of him laughing, or the beginning of it quiet and a little rusty, the laugh of a man rediscovering a capability he had not used in some time. It was not a large laugh. It was not the laugh of a man who found things endlessly amusing. It was the laugh of a man who had been given something he had not expected, and was not yet entirely sure how to hold, but was glad of it. She did not look at him. She looked at the shelf. But she was smiling, and it was not a performance of smiling. It was the real thing, the kind that comes from somewhere below decision, and she let it stay on her face, because she was in her own home and she did not need to put it away. That night she went outside alone. She had told him she wanted air, which was true, and he had nodded and not asked for more explanation, which was one of the things about him she had come to trust. She stood on the frozen ground in front of the cabin and looked up at the Beartooth Mountains. The snow had stopped. The clouds had moved through and left behind a sky of extraordinary clarity, the kind that appears after the first snow of the season, when the air has been washed clean, the stars very bright and very numerous, and the mountains visible all the way up to the peaks, white now against the dark. The snow settling into the contours of the rock in a way that made them look permanent, definitive, like something that has been true for a long time and intends to go on being true. She put her right hand to the birthmark below her left ear. She felt the small curve of it under her fingertip, the familiar shape. The thing she had covered without thinking for so many years that the gesture had become automatic, had become as reflexive as the pause at the threshold, both of them habits of a person who had learned to apologize for taking up space. She held her hand there for a moment. Then she lowered it. Not quickly, not with any drama. She just lowered her hand and let it rest at her side, and stood with her face uncovered in the cold air, under the clear sky, the birthmark her mother had called a mark of the moon, visible to no one, except the mountains and the stars, which had never been in the habit of judging anything. She thought about her mother's handwriting, the careful letters on the page she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the edges. Every plant has its place, even the ones that grow on stone. She had read that sentence for 15 years as an observation about plants. She had read it and found it beautiful, and applied it to the world, in the general sense that the natural world does not question its own right to exist, and she had found this comforting in the abstract. She understood it now as a sentence her mother had written for her specifically, not for the lichen on the rock face, not for the plants that grew in the difficult places, not as a general principle of botany, for her daughter who would need to hear it, who would need someone to have said it clearly before the person who said it was gone, who would need to find it on a shelf after a long time of looking in the wrong places. Her mother had put it in the book because she had known that Ingrid would keep the book, that the book would go wherever Ingrid went, that it would sit on whatever shelf she had, in whatever house she came to occupy, and that eventually, in the right moment, she would read the sentence and understand what it was actually saying. She stood in the cold and breathed the air, which was clean and sharp, and tasted faintly of snow and pine, and the particular high-altitude clarity that she had not grown up with and was growing into becoming part of her the way places become part of people when they have decided to stay. She was going to stay, not because she had nowhere else, because she was choosing this. The distinction was everything. She went back inside. The fire was good. Reuben was banking it for the night, moving the coals with the iron poker with the practiced efficiency of a man who has tended the same fire in the same fireplace for years. He looked up when she came in. She bolted the door. She took off the coat and hung it on the hook. She sat down at the table, and he came and sat across from her, and they sat in the firelight with the good quiet of the cabin around them. "Saturday?" she said. "Saturday," he said. She looked at him, he looked at her. There was a great deal in the looking that was not being said yet, that was not ready to be said, that existed in the space between them as something that would be named in time at the right pace by people who had both learned to be careful with the things that mattered. She was not afraid of it. That was new. Saturday came in with fog off the mountains, the kind of low white fog that fills the valleys in November and makes the world feel very close and private. The distance reduced to a few hundred feet in any direction, and everything beyond that soft and suggested. By the time they came down into Harrow's Crossing, the fog had begun to lift in places, burning off from the tops of the buildings, showing patches of pale blue sky above that expanded slowly as the morning moved. The Lutheran church was on the far side of the square, a small building white-painted with a bell in a simple wooden tower above the door. The bell was ringing when they arrived, not the full Sunday peal, but a single steady note, regular and clear, carrying through the remaining fog and across the square and out toward the mountains in diminishing echoes. Halverson was at the door. He had put on his good vestments, which he reserved for occasions that required them, and he shook Reuben's hand and then took both of Ingrid's hands in both of his. The gesture of a man who had known her since she was a child, brought to this same church in her mother's arms, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was too much to say, and the right words were not the kind that fit in ordinary sentences. "Your mother would be glad," he said finally. She nodded. She could not speak for a moment, and she did not try to. Inside the church, there were perhaps 12 people. Martha Gould and her husband Charles, who was holding the baby Thomas, now 3 months old, and regarding the proceedings with the round, skeptical attention of an infant who has not yet decided what to make of the world. 3 women who had stood with her in the square. Old aldermen from the trading post who had come, she suspected, less out of sentiment than out of the accurate assessment that this was a significant local event he did not want to miss. The young clerk Aldous from Priest's store, which surprised her until she remembered that Aldous had always been decent in his quiet way, and that decent people sometimes showed up without being asked. She wore the blue dress. She had pressed it that morning with the iron heated on the stove, working the wrinkles out of the fabric with the careful attention she gave to things that deserved care. The dress was not new and would not have been called fine by anyone, but it was clean and pressed, and it was hers, the dress she had taken from the nail on the wall. On the morning everything changed, and it seemed right to wear it now to close that particular loop. She did not cover the birthmark. She had not covered it since the night she stood outside, looking at the mountains. And she did not cover it now, and she did not think about it, which was different from suppressing the thought of it. It simply was not in the category of things requiring attention this morning. Halverson began. His voice in the small church was steady and warm, the voice of a man who had spoken these words many times and had not let repetition hollow them out. The light came through the 2 windows on the south side of the church, winter light, white and clean, laying quiet rectangles on the wooden floor. Outside the windows she could see the snow on the square, the thin first covering of the season, undisturbed except for the tracks they had made coming in. Halverson read from Corinthians. She had heard the passage her whole life and had always found something in it that she couldn't quite reach, some quality of the language that pointed at something real without being able to fully touch it. Now standing in the cold, small church with the winter light on the floor, and Martha Gould's husband shifting the baby on his shoulder. She heard it differently. Reuben was standing beside her. Their arms were nearly touching. Halverson reached the part of the ceremony where the questions are asked. He looked at Reuben first, which was the order, and Reuben said what he was asked to say, in his plain voice, looking forward, then looked at her. Then Halverson looked at her. She looked back at him. She was aware in the periphery of her vision of Reuben, standing beside her, of the people behind them, of the light on the floor, and the cold that came under the door, and the sound of Thomas Gould making a small sound of commentary from somewhere in the pews. She looked at Halverson, and she thought about every door she had ever stopped at left foot first, asking permission from the air. She thought about this door, this particular threshold, and the fact that she had walked through it this morning without stopping. "I do," she said. She said it clearly, fully, the way she said things she meant. Not loudly, not with performance, just clearly so that it was there on the record. In Halverson's precise handwriting that would go into the church register and sit there long after everything else about this morning was memory. She felt Reuben take her hand. His hand was large and calloused and warm, warmer than she had expected in the cold of the church. And she felt the scar on his wrist against the inside of her wrist. And she did not flinch from it. She held his hand back, and Halverson completed what needed to be completed, and said what needed to be said, and outside the bell in the tower, made its single note again steady and clear, going out across the square, and across the rooftops and out toward the mountains, in the way that sound travels in cold air, farther than it would travel in any other season. Afterward they stood outside the church. The fog had gone. The sky was clear and pale blue, the kind of blue that appears in Montana on November mornings when the cold has settled in, and the light has the particular quality of a season that has decided what it is going to be. The snow on the square was bright in it. A few people had come out of shops to see. Not many. Enough. Enough that what happened next would be witnessed and would be talked about, would become one of those small pieces of local history that get passed along over kitchen tables for years, changing slightly in each retelling, but keeping at the center something that is essentially true. Reuben stopped in the middle of the square. He turned to face the people watching. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. "This is my wife," he said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered plainly, without decoration, the way you state a fact about the world that you intend to remain a fact. He looked at the faces watching and continued, "She belongs to no auction, to no debt, to no man's hand but her own choosing." Say, he paused. If any of you have forgotten how she was treated in this square 4 weeks ago, remember it now. And if any of you think of treating her that way again, remember this. Mama say. He was not angry when he said it. He was not performing anything. He was simply standing in the square where the platform had been, in the place where $50 had been counted out onto a table, and he was saying what was true in front of people who had watched the other thing happen and had largely let it happen, because that was what crowds did. And he was not going to let the absence of objection become acceptance. Martha Gould nodded a single firm nod from where she stood near the church steps, with Thomas on her hip. A few people looked at the snow. Dunmore was not there. Carl Bricks was not there. Otto Greer was not there. The people who were there were largely the people who had not laughed, or who had laughed, and were not proud of it, and they received what Reuben said, with the quiet of people who are being given an opportunity to align themselves differently, and who are considering whether to take it. Ingrid stood beside him. She stood with her weight on both feet, evenly, not leaning in any particular direction. She did not look at the ground. She looked at the square, the familiar buildings around its perimeter, the feed barn with its warped doors, the courthouse steps with the flag, the general store that was Priest's store, where she had bought salt and been talked about without her name being lowered. She looked at all of it. She thought about her mother, who had carried a book across an ocean and written in its margins for a daughter she would not be there to advise directly, who had left sentences behind the way you leave provisions for a journey, knowing you cannot take the journey yourself. She thought about August, the mule in the pen next to Grizz, the mule that had been brought back from town without explanation, and now occupied himself with whatever mules occupied themselves with, peaceably and without commentary. She thought about the root cellar and the box of embroidery threads, blue and green and gold, and the frame on the shelf with the needles still through the linen. She thought about the shelf. She thought about more shelf space. She took a breath of the cold, clear air. She did not reach for the birthmark. 3 weeks later, the first proper snowfall of the winter came down off the Beartooth Range, and it came at night quietly, the way the first significant snow of the season always comes, as if it does not want to make a fuss, only to arrive and be there when you wake up. Ingrid woke at first light and lay still for a moment, aware of the particular quality of the quiet. Outside the way, sound travels differently when the ground is covered, absorbed and softened, and she knew before she looked. She got up and went to the south window. The valley was white below them, the lodgepole pines dark against it, the creek hidden somewhere under the smooth cover. The mountains above were fully white, now unified, no longer the patchy early-season snow of October, but the committed white of a winter that had made up its mind. The sky was the pale gray of very early morning, and the snow in the valley caught what light there was and gave it back, diffused, sourceless, the whole landscape its own illumination. She stood at the window for a while. Then she went to the kitchen and built up the fire in the stove and began to make bread. Not flat bread, not the quick morning rounds, but proper bread, the sourdough she had been maintaining in its ceramic crock, fed and rested and ready. She took the dough she had set the night before and turned it out onto the floured board, feeling the resistance of it under her hands alive in the way of fermented things responsive, not passive. She pushed and folded and turned it with the movements that her body knew without instruction, the work of many years in many kitchens, absorbed into the hands and kept there. The smell of the starter was warm and slightly sour and entirely right. She shaped the loaves and covered them with the cloth and set them near the stove to prove. She put the kettle on. She stood in the kitchen in the early light and listened to the stove tick and the snow settle outside and the horse shift in the pen. A single sound hooves on packed earth. Grizz saying that he was present and required his morning. She heard Reuben wake. She knew the sound of it. She had learned the particular sound of him going from sleep to wakefulness, the way the quality of the silence in the cabin changed the small sounds of a man becoming present in the world after the absence of sleep. She had learned this the way she had learned the order of the firewood and the arrangement of the tools, not deliberately, but by proximity, by the accumulation of mornings. She heard him pull on his boots. She heard him cross the main room. She did not turn around. He stopped in the doorway between the rooms. She could feel him looking at the window at the snow outside, at the white valley below. "Snow," he said. "Yes," she said. He came into the kitchen. He stood near the stove for the warmth the way he did, and she poured the hot water into the cups and set one near him without looking, and he picked it up. "The trap line will need checking before the drifts," he said. "I know," she said. "After breakfast." He looked at the loaves proving under the cloth. He looked at her hands, still faintly dusted with flour, moving the cups into their places on the table with the ease of a person in a kitchen that belongs to them. He drank his tea. She uncovered the loaves, assessed them, covered them again. On the shelf across the room, her mother's book stood beside the embroidery frame. The frame was not on the shelf only. Over the past 2 weeks, she had taken it down 3 times. The first time, she had only looked at the work, the flowers in blue and green, the needles still through the linen, the thread still attached. The second time, she had put the frame on the table and sat with it in the lamplight for an hour without touching it, the way you sit with something you are not sure about. The third time, she had gone to the root cellar and brought up the box of threads and opened it, and she had looked at the colors, and then she had looked at the unfinished work, and she had picked up the needle. She had not followed the pattern that was there already. She had not tried to continue what Celeste had begun, which was not hers to continue. She had started her own section in the blank fabric at the left edge of the frame, and she had chosen the green thread, the color of yarrow in summer, and she had begun something that was not flowers, that was not anything with a name yet, only a shape she was working out as she went. 3 rows, 4. The work was small, and the progress was slow, and she was not a skilled embroiderer, nothing like the precision of whoever had made the blue flowers. But she was working, and the needle went through and came back, and the thread lay in the linen and held there, and that was what mattered. Reuben had seen her doing it one evening, and had not said anything. He had looked at the frame in her hands, and then looked at the fire, and she had continued working, and neither of them had spoken about it, which was, she had come to understand one of the ways he expressed acceptance of things, not with words, but with continued presence. The bread was ready by mid-morning. She put the loaves in the oven and went outside with him to see to the horses before he left for the trap line. The snow was past her ankles on the path to the pen, pristine and unbroken, except for where the horses had moved along the inside of the fence. Grise put his head over the rail when she appeared, his breath a steady cloud in the cold, and she put her hand on his nose, and he accepted this with dignity. She watched Reuben saddle him, the familiar sequence of it, the way the horse stood patient and cooperative with the particular attentiveness of an animal that knows the person beside it and trusts them. "I'll be back before dark," he said. "The bread will be ready," she said. He swung up. He looked down at her from the horse in the white morning, with the snow-covered valley spreading out below them, and the mountains enormous above, white and certain and completely themselves. He looked at her for a moment. "Ingrid," he said. She looked up at him. He was not a man who said things easily. She knew this by now, knew it the way she knew the order of the wood, and the sound of his waking, and the particular flatness his face took on when he was receiving difficult news. She knew that what he said, he meant, and that what he did not say, he was either still deciding or was carrying in a way that would find its form in time. He said, "I'm glad you stayed." She looked at him on the horse in the snow with the mountains behind him, and the cold, clear air of November around them both. She thought about $50. She thought about a foot that stopped in a doorway. She thought about yarrow and vinegar and 3 days and a mule brought back from town without explanation and $200 spent quietly in the dark before anyone asked. She thought about every plant has its place, and her mother's handwriting, and the green thread on the linen. She thought about this morning. This particular morning, standing in her own kitchen with her hands in her own dough while the snow came down outside. "I'm glad too," she said. He rode out through the gate and up the slope toward the tree line, and she watched him go until the pines took him. And then she stood for another moment in the white quiet, her breath making its small cloud, the snow holding the silence the way snow does. Patient and complete, she walked back to the cabin. She stopped at the threshold, left foot forward, and then she stepped through without stopping into the warmth and the smell of the bread coming up from the oven, and she pulled the door closed behind her against the cold, and she did not pause and she did not ask permission. She was home,